My hands spasmed on the wheel, knuckles turning white against the leather as adrenaline spiked, sharp and metallic, in the back of my throat. Outside, the world was nothing but oppressive mist and absolute, suffocating blackness. We were the only two souls existing in this void. I knew the registration was expired, a small administrative failure born of a much larger emotional collapse. But the fear that gripped me was disproportionate. With a heavy sigh that rattled in my chest, I eased onto the gravel shoulder, the tires crunching like breaking bones. I hadn't intended to be out here, miles from anything that resembled a destination. The apartment had become a museum of a failed relationship. The silence there so loud it vibrated in my teeth. It still smelled like her. That specific, haunting mix of expensive sandalwood and rain that used to mean safety, and now just meant absence. So I had fled to the only place that felt like mine anymore, this car. It was a fragile metal shell, a capsule hurtling through the night, protecting me from the vast, indifferent world outside. But now, stationary on the side of a nameless highway, the illusion of safety was dissolving. The engine idled, a low tremor that traveled up through the seat, grounding me in a reality I wanted to escape. Sitting there, waiting for the inevitable approach of authority, my mind wasn't on the ticket or the fine. It was looping through the final arguments, the way her voice had turned cold and clinical, the way I had felt small in my own kitchen. That feeling of smallness was back now, amplified by the flashing lights cutting through the fog. The hazard lights clicked, a rhythmic, synthetic heartbeat. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound was deafening in the sudden quiet of the cabin. Condensation was already weeping down the passenger window, blurring the distorted red strobe of the cruiser behind me into a bloody, pulsing bruise on the night. The fog pressed against the glass, a gray, formless weight trying to get in, mirroring the confusion in my own head. I felt raw, brittle. Like if someone spoke to me too sharply, I might just shatter into 1,000 pieces right there on the driver's seat. I was holding myself together with surface tension and little else. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked hollow, dark circles carved by weeks of insomnia and the kind of crying that leaves you dehydrated. I wasn't ready for a confrontation. I wasn't ready to be perceived, to be spoken to be forced into the performance of a functioning adult when I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. The cold from the window seeped into my shoulder, a sharp reminder of the thin barrier between me and the elements. I tried to regulate my breathing, to compose a mask of normalcy, but my hands were trembling. I watched the rearview mirror, waiting for the inevitable. The cruiser door opened. A figure emerged, a silhouette cut from the darkness, moving with a terrifying, deliberate slowness. The boots crunched on the gravel, each step heavy with purpose, closing the distance between my fragile solitude and her formidable reality. I wasn't just stopped. I was trapped, pinned against the shoulder of the world by a force I couldn't see clearly yet. The silence stretched, heavy and charged, until the sound that ended the suspension of time finally came. The sharp, authoritative rap of knuckles against the glass. The glass slid down with a mechanical whine that sounded like a scream in the silence. Immediately, the sanctuary of the car was breached. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth, ozone, and the metallic tang of the fog, but it was the light that hit me first. The beam of her flashlight was absolute, an invasive white pillar that cut through the darkness and pinned me against the seat. I squinted, turning my head away instinctively, shielding my eyes with a trembling hand. But the presence looming in the window demanded acknowledgement. She was a formidable silhouette against the swirling gray mist. Even before I could make out her features, the sheer architecture of her stance communicated power. She didn't lean in with the casual boredom of a routine stop. She stood with a rigid, immaculate posture that suggested she was immovable, a monolith of authority planted on the side of this desolate highway. The brim of her campaign hat cast a sharp, angular shadow over her eyes, rendering her expression unreadable, a void where judgment usually sat. The uniform was crisp, tailored, and intimidating, a stark contrast to the mess I felt internally. "License and registration, please." The voice was a low contralto, rich and terrifyingly calm. It wasn't the bored, nasal drawl of a bureaucrat or the aggressive bark I had feared. It was smooth, polished like riverstone, and it vibrated in the small, cold space between us. It was a voice that expected compliance not because it demanded it, but because the alternative was inconceivable. I fumbled for my wallet, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. The simple motor function of retrieving a plastic card felt like defusing a bomb. My fingers were numb, not just from the sudden intrusion of the cold, but from the shock that had drained the blood from my extremities. I managed to grip the license, but as I extended my hand toward the open window, the tremor was undeniable. My hand shook violently, a physical betrayal of the composure I was desperately trying to simulate. The flashlight beam shifted. It moved from my face, tracking the erratic movement of my hand, and then, with deliberate slowness, it swept past me. I watched the beam cut across the passenger seat and land in the back. It illuminated the chaos I had thrown there hours ago. The duffel bags stuffed to bursting, the loose clothes on hangers that looked like ghosts in the back seat, the cardboard box of books I couldn't bear to leave behind. The evidence of a life rapidly dismantled and shoved into a sedan was laid bare. The light lingered on the bags for a second too long. The silence stretched, heavy and charged. I held my breath, waiting for a comment on the expiry date, on the speed, on the broken taillight I knew I had. Instead, the beam snapped back to me. She wasn't looking at the license anymore. She was looking at my hands, still trembling in the space between us. "You okay to drive, ma'am?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was an assessment. For the first time, I looked past the blinding light and saw the lower half of her face. Her jaw was set, strong and defined, her mouth a neutral line that betrayed nothing. But the question hung there, stripping away the pretense that this was just a traffic stop. She had seen the tremor. She had seen the bags. She knew I wasn't just a commuter running late. She knew I was a fugitive from my own circumstances. "I'm fine," I lied, the words brittle and unconvincing even to my own ears. "Just cold." She didn't answer immediately. She reached in, her hand encased in black leather. When she took the plastic card from my shaking fingers, the glove brushed against my skin. It was a fleeting contact, rough and cool, but the sensation was indelible. It wasn't just a transfer of documentation. It was a breach of the containment field I had built around myself. She studied the ID, then looked back at me, her gaze piercing the shadow of her hat. "Sit tight," she said, the command soft but absolute. "I'll be right back." She stepped back into the swirling mist, the crunch of her boots on the gravel retreating with the same deliberate rhythm as her approach. The flashlight beams swung away, slicing through the fog like a lighthouse beacon, before disappearing toward her cruiser. I was left alone in the sudden, crushing darkness of the cab, the afterimage of her silhouette burned into my retinas. I sat there, my heart hammering against my ribs, realizing that the isolation of a car had shifted. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a waiting room. The waiting became a specific, hermetic kind of torture. In the vacuum she left behind, the silence wasn't empty. It was crowded with the ghosts I was trying to outrun. The engine idled, a rough, vibrating purr that felt like the only living thing in the universe besides the thudding of my own heart. I stared at the steering wheel, tracing the worn stitching with eyes that burned from exhaustion, trying to keep my mind blank. But the anxiety was a rising tide. Every second that ticked by was a second where the reality of my life, the boxes in the back, the empty apartment behind me, the uncertain void ahead, threatened to crash through the thin glass of my composure. Then the world outside began to change, shifting from dark to impossible. The fog, which had been a drifting, spectral presence, thickened with terrifying speed. It didn't just obscure the view, It erased the world completely. The darkness beyond the windows turned into a solid, opaque wall of white, swirling and churning like a living thing with a malicious intent. The red and blue lights of the cruiser behind me ceased to be distinct flashes. They diffused into a sickening, rhythmic pulse that lit up the mist like a bruised sky. It felt as though the car had been swallowed whole, suspended in a featureless purgatory where time and direction held no meaning. I was no longer on a highway. I was in a capsule, drifting in a sea of milk and static. When she returned, she didn't emerge from the darkness so much as she solidified out of the gray. Her boots crunched on the gravel, but the cadence had shifted. The aggressive, predatory stalk of the initial stop was gone, replaced by a measured, heavy tread. She didn't shine the light in my face this time. She tapped on the glass, a sharp, hollow sound that made me jump in my skin. I rolled the window down, bracing for the ticket, for the judgment, for the official sanction of my failure. But the air that rushed in was different now. Thicker, wetter, tasting of ozone and impending storms. "Kill the engine," she said. The command was low, stripped of the procedural edge she'd held before. Her face was still shadowed by the brim of her hat, but the set of her shoulders had changed. She wasn't looming over me. She was leaning in, conspiratorial, urgent. "Is there a problem?" My voice was a whisper, swallowed instantly by the damp air. "There's a wreck about 2 miles up," she said, her voice flat. "Tanker jackknifed across both lanes, took down a utility pole. The road is closed." I stared at her, the words failing to compute. "Closed? But I need to keep going." "Nobody is going anywhere tonight," she replied. And for a second, I thought I saw a flicker of something like sympathy in the hard line of her jaw. "Visibility is 0. Even if the road was clear, I wouldn't let you drive in this soup. It's a death trap out there." A strange, cold resignation washed over me. It should have been panic. I should have been fighting this, arguing, desperate to put miles between me and the past. But instead, I felt the tension in my shoulders snap. Of course I couldn't leave. It was almost funny, in a dark, twisted way. I had packed my life into this car to escape a cage, only to drive straight into a smaller, colder one. The universe had simply slammed a door in my face. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now we wait," she said. "Could be an hour, could be till dawn. Turn off the car, save your gas." I reached out and twisted the key. The engine died, and with it, the heater. The sudden silence was heavy and absolute, ringing in my ears. She didn't walk away. She didn't retreat to the warm, dry sanctuary of her cruiser to wait out the delay in comfort. Instead, she straightened up and turned her back to me. She walked a few paces to the front of her patrol car and leaned back against the fender, crossing her arms over her chest. She stood there, a dark, immovable sentinel in the swirling white void, watching the empty road, watching the fog, keeping a vigil over my stranded, broken little world. The cold permeated the car with a violence that felt personal. The engine's warmth dissipated in seconds, leaving me in a tin box that offered no defense against the encroaching night. I sat huddled in my coat, arms wrapped tight around my ribs, watching my breath plume in the stagnant air. Outside, the trooper remained a statue against the swirling white void, unbothered by the elements. But I was shaking. The chill seeped through the glass, settling into the marrow of my bones, a physical manifestation of the isolation I had been driving toward all night. She turned. Even through the condensation on the windshield, I saw the movement of her head. She watched me for a moment, a dark shape analyzing a shivering mess, and then pushed off the fender. She walked back to my door, her movements fluid and decisive, stripped of the earlier aggression. "You're turning blue," she said through the glass, her voice muffled but commanding. She signaled for me to open the door. "Grab your phone. Come sit in the unit. It's warm." It wasn't a request. It was a retrieval. I grabbed my phone, my fingers stiff and clumsy, and pushed the door open. The night air hit me like a physical blow, wet and biting. For the 10 seconds it took to walk from my car to hers, I was completely exposed. The fog swirled around my legs, dampening my jeans, trying to drag me down into the asphalt. I felt small, fragile, a leaf blown across the highway. I climbed into the passenger seat of the cruiser and pulled the heavy door shut. The silence that followed was both instant and profound. The wind, the fog, the desolate highway, it was all cut off. The interior was a sensory overload. It was warm, aggressively so, the vents blasting heat that prickled my frozen skin. But it was the smell that hit me hardest. It smelled like her. Leather, gun oil, old coffee, and something sharper, maybe starch or a specific kind of soap. It was a distinct scent of discipline and long nights. I sat inside the machine of authority. The dashboard was a constellation of lights and screens. The police radio hummed with a low, static-filled chatter, a constant stream of codes and locations that reminded me I was sitting next to the state itself. A laptop mount separated us, but not by much. The proximity was jarring. Outside, she had been a silhouette, a symbol. In here, she was terrifyingly real. I was inches away from her. I could see the grain of the fabric on her uniform sleeve, the way her thigh muscle tensed as she shifted in the seat, the gleam of the silver nameplate on her chest. The space was tight, intimate, dangerous. I pressed myself against the passenger door, trying to minimize my footprint, trying not to encroach on her territory. She didn't look at me. She was staring out the windshield, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. She had removed her hat, placing it on the dashboard, and the absence of it changed her face. She looked younger, sharper, but no less formidable. Her hair was pulled back tight, severe, exposing the strong line of her neck. "Here," she said, breaking the silence. She reached down beside her seat and pulled out a battered stainless steel thermos. She unscrewed the cup with one hand, a casual display of dexterity that I found myself staring at, and poured a measure of steaming liquid. She held it out to me. The steam curled up between us, a white flag in the dim red light of the dashboard. "It's black," she said, "but it's hot." I hesitated, looking at the cup, then at her profile. The power dynamic had shifted so abruptly my head spun. 5 minutes ago, I was a suspect, a potential threat to public safety. Now, we were just two people seeking shelter from a storm, sharing a confined space that felt less like a vehicle and more like a confession booth. I took the cup. Our fingers didn't touch, but the heat radiating from the metal transferred to my skin, a shock of warmth that traveled up my arm. "Thank you," I whispered. I took a small sip. It was bitter, strong enough to strip paint, but it tasted like salvation. I held the cup with both hands, letting the warmth seep into my palms, trying to stop the trembling that had nothing to do with the cold anymore. The official script had dissolved, evaporating into the steam rising from the thermos. In the close, overheated confines of the cruiser, the rigid architecture of the traffic stop, officer and civilian, accuser and accused, began to soften at the edges. The silence that settled between us wasn't the hostile vacuum of the roadside. It was a heavy, expectant pause, the kind that exists in a confessional before the first sin is whispered. I held the coffee like a talisman, focusing on the heat radiating through the steel, trying to anchor myself in the physical world, while my internal landscape was still trembling from the aftershocks of the night. She shifted in her seat, the leather creaking, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet. She wasn't looking at me. Her gaze was fixed on the swirling wall of white beyond the windshield, her profile etched in the dim amber glow of the dashboard instruments. "You're running heavy," she said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an accusation. It was a flat, observational fact, delivered with the same calm certainty she had used to tell me the road was closed. "I saw the back seat. That's not an overnight bag. That's a departure." I opened my mouth to deflect, to offer the standard, sanitized lie about moving for a job or visiting family, but the words died in my throat. The defense mechanisms I had carefully constructed over the last few weeks, the feigned competence, the mask of "I'm fine," felt suddenly useless here. There was something about the isolation, the fog, and the formidable woman sitting inches away that made lying feel like a waste of precious energy. I was exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that made my limbs feel like lead. I didn't know where else to put it, I admitted, my voice barely audible over the hum of the heater. The apartment, it stopped being a home about a month ago. Tonight, it just felt like a cage. I risked a glance at her. She hadn't turned, but her stillness had intensified. She was listening with a terrifying totality, absorbing the information without judgment. I just started driving, I continued, the confession spilling out not in a torrent, but in slow, painful drops. I thought if I got far enough away, the noise in my head would stop. I thought I could outrun the silence she left behind. I stopped, horrified by my own vulnerability. I had just handed a piece of my raw, bleeding history to a state trooper I had met 20 minutes ago. I waited for the professional pivot, for her to tell me to drive safely and get some rest. Instead, she finally turned her head. The shadows shifted across her face, revealing eyes that were dark and intelligent, stripping away the surface to look at the wreckage underneath. "You can't outdrive it," she said softly. The timbre of her voice had dropped an octave, losing its command edge and gaining a rougher, more personal texture. "The car is just a smaller room. The ghosts fit in the passenger seat just fine." It was a profound, unsettling validation. She wasn't offering a solution. She was offering recognition. She understood the geography of escape. "I thought the highway would be empty," I murmured. "The highway is never empty," she replied, looking back out at the mist. Her hand moved, fingers tracing the rim of the steering wheel absent-mindedly. At this hour, it's full of people running from things, or running to things that won't fix them. I see them every night. I pull them over, I look into their cars, and I see the same look you have. What look is that? The look of someone who realizes that a way isn't a place you can find on a map. The air in the car grew heavy, charged with a sudden, undeniable intimacy. It was a shared solitude, two people acknowledging that they were both awake in a world that was asleep, both familiar with the weight of things unsaid. The badge, the gun, the uniform, they all faded into the background, leaving just the woman and the truth she had just laid on the console between us. Then, the radio screamed. A burst of static shattered the moment, followed by a garbled, aggressive voice barking codes and coordinates. The spell broke instantly. She straightened, her eyes snapping to the radio, the professional mask sliding back into place with a jarring efficiency. The intimacy evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of her duty, reminding me that this sanctuary was temporary, and she was still the law. The radio chatter died as quickly as it had erupted, cutting off the aggressive intrusion of the outside world. But the silence that rushed back in to fill the void was different. It was no longer the comfortable, sheltering quiet of a shared refuge. It had curdled into something sharper, something that hummed with a dangerous, magnetic frequency. The air in the cruiser, already overheated and smelling of coffee and leather, seemed to thicken, becoming a physical medium that conducted every small movement, every breath, every shift in weight. The fear I had felt on the roadside, that primal, animalistic reaction to the red and blue lights, had transmuted into a different kind of adrenaline. It was the sudden, terrifying awareness of gravity. I found myself unable to look away from her hands. They were resting on the steering wheel now, relaxed but ready, bathed in the amber glow of the instrument panel. They were capable hands, strong and weather-beaten, stripped of the gloves that had made them anonymous. There was a thin, white line running across her left knuckles, an old injury that disrupted the smooth skin. It was a flaw in the otherwise perfect presentation of state authority, a piece of human history written on the body of the law. I stared at that scar, wondering, with a sudden and breathless intensity, what had caused it. A struggle? A mistake? A moment of carelessness in a life that demanded constant vigilance? It was a crack in the porcelain, a detail that made her achingly real. She turned her head, catching me staring. In the dashboard light, her eyes were no longer shadowed voids beneath the brim of a hat. They were illuminated, revealing a depth that unsettled me. They were the color of deep water, intelligent and assessing. But the professional detachment was gone. In its place was a quiet, simmering recognition. She wasn't looking at a driver with an expired registration anymore, or a problem to be managed. She was looking at a woman who had packed her life into boxes to outrun a ghost, and she didn't look away. "You think you're the only one who uses the night to hide?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it filled the cabin, vibrating against the glass. The question hung in the air, charged and heavy. It wasn't an interrogation. It was an offering. It was a dismantling of the hierarchy. I realized then that the uniform, the badge, the terrifying silhouette on the highway, it was all just another version of the metal shell I was driving. She was fortified. She was protected. But inside the fortress, she was just as solitary as I was. We were both wearing armor to keep the world from touching the soft, bruised parts of us. "I thought I was," I admitted, my voice trembling. "Until now." The space between us, occupied only by the gear shift and the laptop mount, felt suddenly negligible. I could feel the heat radiating from her, a physical presence that blurred the boundaries of my own body. It was a terrifying intimacy, forged in the vacuum of a closed highway. We were two ships anchored in the same fog, signaling to each other across the dark water. I felt a sudden, reckless urge to reach out, to trace the scar on her hand, to bridge the gap and test the reality of this strange, suspended moment. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the heavy electric potential of a storm waiting to break. She took a breath, and I saw the rise and fall of the nameplate on her chest. She was going to say something else, something that might have shattered the professional line irrevocably. Her lips parted slightly, the severe line of her mouth softening into something approaching vulnerability. But then, the world intruded. Beyond the windshield, the impenetrable wall of white began to fracture. The swirling milk of the fog thinned, tearing apart to reveal the wet, black asphalt of the highway. The red and blue lights of the cruiser, which had been diffused into a soft pulse, sharpened into distinct, rotating beams that cut through the night. The suspension of time was ending. The universe was remembering its rules. The road was opening up, and with it, the inevitable return to who we were supposed to be. The thinning mist wasn't a relief. It was a form of exile. As the wet, black asphalt reemerged from the whiteout, stretching forward into a darkness that no longer felt protective, a quiet terror took root in my chest that was entirely separate from the fear of authority. I realized with a jarring clarity that I didn't want to leave. This cruiser, with its aggressive heat and scent of stale coffee and gun oil, had become a strange, impossible sanctuary. Outside, the world was vast, cold, and indifferent. Inside, there was a specific, heavy gravity, and there was her. The destination I had been driving toward, some nameless motel, some undefined new life, felt terrifyingly abstract compared to the solid, vibrating reality of this seat. I felt a desperate, irrational urge to lock the door, to barricade myself inside this suspension of time before the clock started ticking again. She sensed the shift. She was a creature of observation, trained to read the subtle tremors of human behavior, the micro-expressions of guilt or fear. She turned in her seat, shifting her weight so she was facing me fully, the leather of her duty belt creaking against the plastic console. The movement was deliberate, closing the small emotional distance we had maintained. The amber light from the dashboard caught the sharp angle of her cheekbone and the depth of her eyes, which were no longer scanning the horizon, but were fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. It was the kind of gaze that didn't just look at you, it looked through you, cataloging the damage and the structural integrity in a single sweep. "You're thinking about staying," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was low, rumbling in the small space, stripping away the last layer of pretense. "You're looking at that road like it's a sentence, not a way out." I couldn't deny it. My throat felt tight, constricted by the truth she had just laid bare. "It feels safer in here," I whispered, the admission feeling dangerous, a vulnerability I couldn't afford but couldn't stop. "Out there, it's just me and the silence." "Safety is a trick of the light," she murmured, leaning in slightly. Her hand moved from the steering wheel to rest on the center console, inches from my own. The proximity was electric, a live wire humming in the damp air. "This car is just metal and glass. The only thing making it safe is that you stopped moving long enough to catch your breath." She held my gaze, refusing to let me look away. The air between us was thick, heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement of what this was. Not a traffic stop, but a collision of two solitary orbits. "Listen to me," she said, and her tone shifted, blurring the line between officer and something far more personal. "Don't drive just to put miles on the odometer. You can cross 3 state lines tonight and still wake up in the same room you left if you don't know what you're actually running toward. The baggage in the back seat? It gets heavier the further you go." I felt a stinging sensation behind my eyes, a rush of heat that had nothing to do with the vents. I felt seen, truly terrifyingly seen, in a way I hadn't been in years. She wasn't offering a ticket or a warning. She was offering a map to a territory I had been too afraid to navigate. She saw the fugitive in me, and instead of chasing, she had offered a pause. "I don't know where I'm going," I confessed, the words falling into the space between us like stones. "Then stop driving until you do," she said softly. Before I could answer, before I could lean into that gravity, the radio shattered the moment. A sharp, static-filled voice announced the all clear. The road was open. The spell was broken. The handle of the cruiser door clicked under my fingers, a sharp, mechanical severance that signaled the end of the truce. Pushing the door open felt less like exiting a vehicle and more like being evicted from a warm, living planet back into the vacuum of space. The heat that had been wrapping around me, soaking into my frozen clothes and thawing my numbness, was ripped away instantly. The night air rushed in to reclaim the space, aggressive and biting, carrying the damp, heavy scent of wet asphalt and the lingering ozone of the storm. It was a physical shock, a jarring transition that made my teeth ache. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, one foot on the gravel, suspended between the sanctuary of the trooper's domain and the desolate reality of my own. I stepped out. The door slammed shut behind me, sealing the warmth and the radio chatter and the scent of leather inside. I was back in the wild, exposed and shivering. The fog had lifted enough to reveal the jagged line of the tree line and the slick black ribbon of the highway. But the darkness was still absolute, pressing in against the flashing lights. The walk back to my sedan was the longest 10 yards of my life. My boots scuffed against the gravel, the sound harsh and lonely after the intimacy of the cruiser. I felt small again, a fragile object moving through a landscape that didn't care if I survived it. But I wasn't walking alone. Behind me, I heard the heavy, rhythmic crunch of her boots. She wasn't escorting a suspect this time. She was a rear guard, a protective presence ensuring the transition was safe. It was a subtle distinction, but it changed the entire temperature of the night. She wasn't chasing me. She was watching me go. I reached my car and pulled the handle. The interior was a cryogenic chamber. It smelled of stale air and the faint, cloying sweetness of the sandalwood perfume that haunted the upholstery, a scent that, 20 minutes ago, had been a source of comfort, but now just smelled like stagnation. I slid into the driver's seat, the leather stiff and unforgiving against my legs. It felt alien, this metal shell I had been calling home. The silence here was dead, unlike the vibrating electric silence we had just shared. I hadn't even reached for the ignition when her shadow fell across the window. She was there, looming in the frame again, but the terrifying monolith from the start of the night was gone. I rolled down the window, bracing myself for the return of the official script, for the ticket I deserved. There was no flashlight this time. The ambient wash of the red and blue lights from her cruiser cast her face in shifting, violent hues, but her expression was steady. She wasn't holding a citation book. Her hands were empty, resting on her belt near the buckle, relaxed. "You're clear," she said. The voice was the same low contralto, but the command frequency had been dialed down. It was the voice of the woman who knew about the ghosts, not the officer who knew the statutes. "The road is slick on the overpasses. It's deceptive. It looks dry, but it's black ice." I looked up at her, searching for the subtext in the shadows of her eyes. "I'll be careful. And get that taillight fixed," she added, almost as an afterthought. "You don't want to give anyone a reason to stop you again. Not everyone out here is looking to help." The warning landed with the weight of a stone. It wasn't about the equipment violation. It was a directive to survive, to keep my armor intact, to not let the world find a crack in the defense. Take care of yourself, because you matter. "I won't," I promised. The words felt like a vow. She nodded, a single sharp dip of her chin. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't offer a platitude about a safe trip. Instead, she reached out. Her hand, encased in the black leather glove, came down on the roof of my car, right above the window frame. It rested there for a second, a heavy, solid pressure. It was a grounding touch, a physical anchor connecting me to the earth when I felt like I might float away into the ether. It was a benediction from the state, unexpected and searing. Then she tapped the metal twice. Thud, thud. "Go," she said. She stepped back, the contact broken. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a violent, vibrating intrusion that shook the frame and shattered the last remnants of the spell. The noise was deafening, drowning out the sound of her boots retreating across the gravel. I was back in the machine, back in motion, but the imprint of her hand on the roof felt like it was burning through the metal. The tires caught the pavement with a wet, sticky sound, a stark contrast to the crunch of the gravel that had defined the last hour of my life. I eased the car back onto the highway, the engine's hum rising to a steady drone that vibrated through the floorboards, but my attention was entirely fixed on the glass rectangle hanging above the dashboard. I watched the rearview mirror with a devotion usually reserved for religious icons. The cruiser sat there, a dark, immovable anchor in the center of the road, its red and blue lights still pulsing, cutting through the retreating fog like a heartbeat. She hadn't moved. She was still standing there, a sentinel in the mist, watching my taillights until I was nothing more than a red blur in the distance. As the miles accumulated, the lights in the mirror began to shrink. They transformed from blinding strobes into a rhythmic, distant twinkle. A binary star system dying out in the vastness of the universe. With every yard I put between us, the physical symptoms of the encounter began to recede. The shaking in my hands steadied, the cold sweat on my neck dried. But the internal landscape had been irrevocably altered. The fear that had gripped me when I first saw those lights, the primal terror of being caught, had evaporated. In its place, a strange, aching clarity washed over me. It was a feeling of being hollowed out and scrubbed clean, like a room that had been stripped of all its furniture to reveal the solid, unyielding architecture beneath. The car was quiet again, but the silence wasn't the oppressive, suffocating weight it had been before the stop. The vacuum had been filled. The ghost of my ex-partner, the one that smelled of sandalwood and judgment, felt suddenly insubstantial. For weeks, her memory had been a physical presence in the passenger seat, a constant nagging reminder of my inadequacy. But now, that presence was crowded out by a much more formidable ghost. The memory of the trooper, the scent of leather and rain, The rough texture of her glove, the intelligent, assessing weight of her gaze, occupied the space with a density that made the breakup feel trivial. The narrative of my life had shifted its axis. I wasn't just the woman who had been left. I was the woman who had been seen. I looked at the road ahead. The highway, which had previously appeared as a terrifying, endless void threatening to swallow me whole, now looked like what it actually was. A strip of asphalt and concrete, engineered to take you from one place to another. It wasn't an escape route anymore. It was just a path. The terror of the unknown was still there, lurking in the shadows of the tree line, but the paralyzing dread was gone. I remembered her warning about the black ice on the overpasses. It wasn't a threat. It was a map. She had given me the coordinates of the danger so I could navigate it, not so I could fear it. I drove with a new, deliberate caution, not because I was afraid of the law, but because the hand that had rested on my roof had reminded me that the cargo inside this metal shell, my own life, had value. Her voice replayed in my mind, looping over the hum of the tires. Safety is a trick of the light. It was a mantra that settled into the rhythm of the drive. She had dismantled the illusion that I could find peace by simply outrunning the noise. The ache in my chest was still there, sharp and undeniable, but it felt different now. It wasn't the ache of a wound that wouldn't heal. It was the ache of a muscle that had been used for the first time in months. I was awake. I was driving through the dark, but I wasn't sleepwalking anymore. Then, the quality of the darkness began to change. The absolute ink-black sky ahead started to dilute, turning a bruised, heavy purple. The horizon line sharpened, separating the earth from the heavens. The sun was beginning to crest, bleeding a pale, watery gray into the world. The fog, which had been a wall, became wisps of vapor clinging to the low ground, burning off under the inevitable pressure of the morning. I watched the light hit the dashboard, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and for the first time since I turned the key in my apartment lock, I took a breath that went all the way to the bottom of my lungs. The night was over. The red and blue lights were gone, swallowed by the distance, but the signal remained. The motel sign buzzed with a dying insectoid hum, casting a sickly pink light over the cracked pavement of the parking lot. It was a place I would have found depressing 12 hours ago, a symbol of transience and failure, a way station for people with nowhere else to go. Now, as I pulled into the slot marked 104, it just looked like a place to rest. I killed the engine. The silence that filled the car this time wasn't heavy or suffocating. It was just quiet. The vibration of the road was still in my hands, a phantom sensation humming beneath the skin. But the panic that had driven me across state lines, the frantic need to put distance between myself and the wreckage of my old life, had dissolved. I sat there for a long moment, the key heavy and cold in my hand, looking at the peeling paint on the door in front of me. The night had been a series of unexpected collisions. I had expected judgment from the authority figure in the rearview mirror. I found recognition. I had expected a cage. I found a strange, temporary sanctuary in the passenger seat of a police cruiser. The trooper's presence still lingered in the periphery of my mind, not as a threat, but as a formidable ghost. She was a memory that had weight, a dense gravitational pull that had realigned my orbit. She had seen the chaos I was carrying in the back seat and hadn't told me to hide it, only that I couldn't outrun it. It was a jarring realization that kindness had come from the very source I had feared most. She hadn't just stopped the car, she had stopped the spiral. The encounter felt less like a traffic stop and more like a necessary intervention, a checkpoint set up specifically to catch a soul that was careening off the map. Her voice, with its rough texture and undeniable command, had become a new anchor point. Safety is a trick of the light. The phrase replayed in my head, stripping away the illusion that I needed to find a perfect, unblemished place to land. I didn't need to be safe in the way I had thought. I just needed to be present. I opened the car door and stepped out. The morning air was crisp, smelling of diesel and wet grass, scrubbing the last of the ozone from my senses. I opened the back door and looked at the chaos of my life packed into duffel bags. They didn't look like evidence of a crime anymore. They just looked like clothes, books, things that needed to be put somewhere. The paralyzing weight of the decision to leave was gone, replaced by the mundane, manageable reality of having left. I hefted the first bag. It was heavy, straining my shoulder, but the burden felt physical now, not existential. I walked to the door, unlocked it, and stepped into the stale, air-conditioned coolness of the room. I wasn't hiding here. I was just stopping. The heartbreak was still a bruise that would take time to fade, but the bleeding had stopped. I set the bag down on the cheap bedspread. I felt lighter, as if the gravity of the earth had shifted just enough to let me breathe. I wasn't running anymore. I was simply starting over. We build walls to keep the world out, only to realize we've locked ourselves in with the very things we're trying to escape. Sometimes salvation comes in the form of red and blue lights in a rearview mirror, forcing us to stop before we crash. If you've ever found comfort in the most unlikely of places, tell me in the comments. Subscribe for more stories about the complexities of human connection.